Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now to the West Lothian question. Yes, I know you've been waiting on this. It's one of our favourite constitutional questions, and it describes a conundrum that English MPs are not allowed to vote on matters wholly devolved to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, while MPs from those parts of the UK can vote on matters affecting only England. Well, the government thinks it's got the answer, and today MPs will be voting on its proposals, and Joko has the details.
Yes, Andrew, today we'll see the government's final proposals for English votes for English laws, which the Conservatives pledged to introduce along with further devolution to Scotland. But how would it all work in practice? Well, the Commons Speaker would judge initially whether or not there are any aspects of a new bill that apply to England or England and Wales only. Any bills judged to be solely relevant to those areas will be considered at committee stage by a proportional group of the affected region's MPs. Bills in which some of the provisions apply to England or England and Wales only will be considered by a so-called Legislative Grand Committee of MPs from the affected area. Now, they can reject the specific clauses of the bill certified as relevant only to their region. Next, a process of negotiation begins to reconcile this committee's decisions with those of the entire House of Commons regarding the whole bill, with amendments proposed if necessary. The bill returns to the Legislative Grand Committee for yet another verdict. At this stage, MPs there can veto any specific clauses of the bill which are relevant only to England or England and Wales. A final agreed version of the bill goes before the whole House of Commons for the decisive vote. From there, the bill proceeds to the House of Lords, where the legislative process is unchanged. Got that, Andrew?
Well, I followed that. I was taking notes. I filled 3 pages. Well, the debate's just about to get underway, and let's preempt it. Joining us now to discuss this from Parliament Central Lobby are the SNP's Kirsty Blackman and the Conservative MP Ian Stewart. Welcome to you both. Ian Stewart, there's a complete dog's breakfast, isn't it? No one will be able to understand it.
No, what we're doing is inserting an additional consent stage into the legislative process. This isn't about taking away the right of any MP to debate or take part in any bill before Parliament. But just as the principle of having consent in Scotland was put in place with the Scottish Parliament, we think it's right and balanced for the constitutional settlement of the whole UK to have this English consent mechanism as well.
Why do you have to make it so complicated?
I think it is actually simple. I mean, I know.
I can assure you it's not simple.
It looks complicated when you see it written out, but
that's because it is complicated, Mr.
If you
Stewart.
look at the standing orders of the whole House of Commons, they run into many volumes. This is just a small additional stage. But what we have said, this is one of the changes that was made from the initial proposals in the summer, is that we will review how it's operated after 12 months. And if it does prove to be complicated, I don't think it will, then there'll be an opportunity to tweak it.
OK, that'll probably make it even more complicated. Kirsty Blackman, what's wrong with the principle, putting aside the complications, the principle that since English MPs don't vote on many Scottish domestic matters now, Scottish MPs shouldn't vote on purely English domestic matters?
The major problem with this is the way that the UK is funded. So the way that the Scottish Parliament is funded is that decisions are taken here that affect the block grant. Now, Scottish MPs are going to be excluded from some of the discussion on that, and I don't think that's right. We should be able to make decisions which affect our constituents.
But what evidence do you have that you would be excluded from the block grant discussion? That's a UK-wide matter, so you would be included.
We will be able to vote on the estimates process, which is you can't put amendments to, you can't revise it. We will not be able to take decisions on things like if the government was to decide to privatise swathes of the NHS, reducing the funding for the NHS, we would not be able to make a decision on that because that would be judged as England only, despite the fact that that has a huge knock-on impact on our block grant down the line.
But if you wanted to privatise the NHS in Scotland, and you've gone down that road a bit with all the locums and agency people you're currently employing at huge cost, if you wanted to do that, English MPs couldn't stop you.
The point is that what the English MPs decide, what the UK Parliament decides, is that affects the funding for the Scottish Parliament. What the Scottish Parliament decides, and decisions made by the elected representatives there, who are elected by the people, what that decides does not affect the funding for the English NHS, for example.
So what do you say to that, Mr. Stewart?
Well, the critical point is all bills that pass through the House of Commons will be voted on by all MPs from Scotland, from Northern Ireland, from Wales and England. All we're adding in is an additional consent stage. So Kirsty and all her colleagues, if they're concerned about a particular bill, will have the chance to debate in it, to table amendments and to vote on it. That doesn't change. But I think it's right and proper that we have this additional English consent mechanism where the matter applies only to England.
Okay, what's your answer to that?
We'll be excluded from the scrutiny stage, we'll be excluded from the committee stage, we won't be able to have a
He's
discussion.
shaking his head. Will
on
they
the
be
amendments.
excluded or not?
Well, what we're putting in is an additional stage. There will still be the report stage when amendments can be tabled and we'll go through line-by-line scrutiny. That doesn't change.
Is there anything, Kirsty Blackman, that you think you shouldn't be allowed to vote on that's purely English?
I think it would be reasonable for us to take a decision on the basis of things that are totally don't affect Scotland. So anything that does not have a knock-on effect on Scotland. The way that this is written, the Speaker has to exclude minor consequential effects. So he has to not take into account if it only has a consequential effect on Scotland. So he could be certifying things left, right and centre that have an effect on our
that's the
funding.
Speaker, but I'm still trying to work out what you think would be appropriate not to vote on, or do you just want the freedom to make it up as you go along?
I think we need to make a decision on the basis of what the government brings forward. I mean, we don't know what the government is going to put forward. We don't know what clauses they're going to put forward until they do it.
So
and
you
then
would
we
like
need
to
make
make
a
it up
decision
as
on
you
that
go.
basis.
So you'd like to make it up as you go along.
Unfortunately, we
you will
can't.
pick and choose what you want to vote on, right?
Unfortunately, we can't see into the minds of the government, and we don't know how they're going to decide to frame legislation. So we need to take a decision on the basis of that legislation that comes forward.
Is there not an element, Mr. Stewart, of a Tory power grab in this? You've got a pretty small overall majority. You go down this route, gives you a bigger majority in England.
No, this is a measure that we've been proposing in our manifestos for a long time. This is not a new issue since Tam Dalyell first raised it in the 1970s.
But it's now you've got an overall majority that allows you to do the power grab.
It wasn't feasible in the last government because the Liberal Democrats opposed it, and that was one of the measures that fell by. It was in our manifesto for this election. We won an overall majority, therefore it's perfectly right and proper that we can introduce it.
The polls in Scotland, Kirsty Blackman, suggest that the Scots are quite relaxed about this. They see the justice of Scottish MPs not voting on purely English matters, since English MPs can't vote on purely Scottish matters.
I think that's absolutely true. I think it's totally reasonable for us not to vote on things that don't affect Scotland. The thing is that some of these things that we will be excluded from the committee stage of, will have an effect in Scotland.
Okay. So can you just give me, I'll try one more time, an idea of a major issue for England that you wouldn't vote on?
I think we'll have to wait and see when things come forward. The Leader of the House was talking about bus ticketing, for example. Bus ticketing in England is something that we wouldn't be voting on as Scottish MPs in all likelihood.
What about privatising something that is only for England? Would that be something you'd vote
That
on?
would likely have an impact on funding. If it has an impact on funding, I think it's reasonable for Scottish MPs to consider voting on it.
Mr. Stewart?
I'll say they will be voting on it, on every bill. But to give one example of where SNP members recently did take part in the debate and voted on it, we had the assisted suicide bill a couple of weeks ago, which the House rejected. That is a devolved matter in Scotland. I had no say over what happened in Scotland. Why should potentially a Scottish majority influence what happens in England without England consenting to it?
What's your response to that?
That's the fairness of what we're doing.
What's your response?
I took part in that debate and I voted in that debate because of the effect it will have on my constituents. My constituents were lobbying to be able to come to England if they wanted to choose assisted suicide, so that would have an impact on my individual
But on
constituents.
that basis, then, there's nothing you wouldn't vote on. Because you could always find, setting up academies in England or free schools, you could always find some kind of knock-on effect in Scotland, given now that for the first time in recorded history, English schools are outperforming Scottish schools. You could always find a reason for voting against something.
I think we've previously had a really good record on this. We've previously taken a really principled stance, and we'll continue to take
previously,
a
you had an
principled stance on
entirely
this.
different policy. You were quite clear you would not vote on English matters.
and previously we didn't vote on English matters.
Now
and
you are.
It's still the case that we're not voting on English matters unless they have a direct impact on our constituents or an indirect impact on our
But my
constituents.
point is the way you're defining is that almost anything you could find a reason
That-
has a direct impact on your constituents.
To be fair-
You're giving yourself the freedom to do whatever you want.
To be fair, I have been elected as an MP to this Parliament. I've been elected as an MP to the Parliament of the UK. Now, I've taken the principled stance not to, for example, take part in the Citizen Devolution Bill. But if something has, because of the way that the UK Parliament is structured, because of the way the funding works, if something has an impact on my constituents, I have reserved the right to get involved in that debate.
Well, and given that Scottish universities are alone among members of the European Union charging English students fees in Scotland, shouldn't English MPs get a vote on that?
Sorry?
Well, Scottish universities are charging alone among members of the European Union English students full fees. They're
But
not
that-
charging German or French or Italian or
But
Portuguese or
those
Swedish.
decisions
So
have
shouldn't
been
an
involved-
English MPs have a say on whether Scottish universities should be doing that? It directly affects their
But
constituents.
Those decisions have been devolved to the Scottish Parliament. They have not. English MPs have not been elected to the Scottish Parliament. I have been elected as an MP to the UK Parliament.
Yes, but the point is that what they're saying now, what Mr. Stewart is saying, is that given that you run a number of your own affairs, the English would simply like to have the same privilege.
If the funding system in the UK Parliament was different, if Scotland's block grant did not depend on decisions taken in England on English matters, then absolutely fair enough. We've
But
spoken
you voted
about,
on assisted suicide. That's got nothing to do with the block
I've
grant.
explained why I've voted on assisted
Yeah, but
suicide.
you said it was the block grant was the issue. It's
The,
not,
the
is
block
it?
grant is the issue in, I said, a direct or an indirect consequence for my constituents, not
But-
just in relation to the block grant.
Mrs. Stewart, aren't you really creating two classes of MP here? And aren't you? You are just going to create a complete, complicated muddle that no one will understand who gets to vote on what. And the idea of simplicity, which should be at the core of anything that affects our democratic process, you've just thrown out the window.
Well, to answer a couple of your points here on the two classes of MP, we already have two classes of MP. Kirsty can vote on schools and hospitals in my constituency. I can't vote on schools and hospitals in her constituency. So this is just about rebalancing the arrangements that we have. But I come back to this principal point that it is a consent mechanism we're putting in. It is not about taking away the right of MPs to vote on any bill. And in terms of it being easy to define what is Scottish or English or whatever, we already have it. If you look at any bill, it has territorial extent clauses, which signifies it for the whole UK or for England or England and Wales in whole or in part. So this is not a radical departure from what we have now.
All right, well, if you get your way, we'll see if your colleagues know what they're doing in the next 12 months. I have a feeling we'll be back to this. Though I thank you both. I know you both want to get into the chair and into the chamber and participate in the debate. So we thank you, for your time. Where are you on this, Nigel Farage?
It's all very disappointing. You know, the SNP's position before was very principled. They wouldn't vote on English education. They wouldn't vote on fox hunting, for argument's sake. And now it's pretty clear they will. I guess they want to rile the English as much as they possibly can. And as for the Conservative position, well, you know, I remember after that referendum, you know, Cameron being very, very clear that there was going to be a proper change, English votes on English laws. And the only way that can work is you have to say to Kirsty Blackman, you haven't got the option on this. This is an English-only matter, and we will not allow Scottish MPs to vote. And if we do that, it'll be much fairer, in my opinion, all round.
And that will be the Speaker's role.
Yes, it would.
Okay, we
Now,
need to move on.
I've been getting away with it all